I've been arguing with some seriousness, and you can get the whole essay in 2 weeks ago's New York Times, that the horror movie is more than an occasion for sex and violence, particularly to young people. The argument in a sentence or two is this, if I can find page 2. Yeah, here we are. What is there in the horror film that makes it such attractive film fare? That was your question, right? Why is there such an endless stream flickering on our movie screens of giant ants, creatures out of black lagoons, vampires, homemade homo sapiens, wolfmen, brain eaters, mad scientists, and voluptuous sacrificial victims? It is easy enough to say that the films are overtly violent and covertly sexual, and give their audiences, therefore, the twin thrills necessary for success in such ventures. But that answer, though partly true, fails to get at a special dimension of the horror film, the lurking religious content which gives to many of these films their sense of authority. Now, again, I flatter myself that I say appalling things in nice, quiet prose. If you hear what I just said, your hair should turn gray. Mine has turned several times grayer than it used to be since I discovered this. What I'm saying is this, and most of the rest of this is justification for that remark, and then I will come to the ultimate, the final justification, the sentence that says it all. I've tried to call attention in this brief space to the ways in which the most representative myths of the horror genre are able to strike chords of religious feeling. The discussion could be prolonged to deal with other biblical themes as they manifest themselves in these films. The story of Noah, for example, occurs frequently in films based on the last man on earth theme. Sodom and Gomorrah find their fate echoed in the Cataclysm, particularly atomic cataclysm films. And finally, there's the Book of Revelations, which is certainly the first source of the various beast and vampire tales that haunt the screens. If you have not read the Book of Revelations, I promise you, you will never watch Bob Wilkins again. It is simply the most single horror flick ever made. And it's free. It's in the Bible. Open it and read. Magnificent. The prose is fine, too. Okay, but perhaps the point has already been made. I still am looking for a sentence that seems to have evaded me. Well, there's 2, there's 3. There's one sentence I know I wrote which I want to read to you. Well, I don't find it, so I'll tell it to you. Maybe what that sentence says in effect is that America's churches and synagogues have attained a kind of neuter tone in which the mysteries, the great, great mysteries, are not presented as mysteries at all. The blood is the life. I promise you, hardly a person in church remembers that it is blood that is being spoken of. That Christ was crucified. The most vigorous horror film, one of the most vigorous horror films I know, is the crucified Christ. The anguish in his face, the nails in the palms of his hands. No one remembers that he's suffering up there. What you remember is, are you wearing your tie? You can't go to church without a nice necktie. Are your shoes shined? The smell of blood does not permeate either the Christian churches or the synagogues. None of the sweaty ghastlinesses that the story of Christ or any of the great Old Testament stories were meant to remind us of have any further resonance in the synagogues. They're neutral places, comfortable, clean. I go with some frequency to a synagogue Friday night after Friday night, and I like it. We all sing, we have a nice time, but that's not what the synagogue is for. It wasn't intended to be a nice time. Church is a nice time. You get cleaned up once a week, and somebody says something reassuring, and you go home. Sweat and semen and blood are involved in the mysteries. That's the whole business of plucking out the heart that the Mayans had. I'm not recommending it, but the people who watched that ceremony were certainly aware that blood was related to life. And I'm saying that particularly younger people who don't get any religious education at all, even when they go to those places, recognize in the sudden upthrust of a creature from the Black Lagoon that God made a world that is stupefying, that is horrifying occasionally, and that it is a mystery, and that you have to think about the creature from the glass. You know, he comes up because something went wrong with our atomic bomb. There's always some moral connection like that. The films, I am suggesting, pulsate with the remnant religious energy that still hovers in our culture. And in a sense, in a horrible sense, the great biblical stories are surviving in the catacombs of the all-night movie theater. Isn't that awful? I hope you feel it as awful. You don't look as if you feel it as awful. And that's when David was most, that was the years that you were at state, yeah. And you were involved with Happening House too, as I recall, in some tangential way. Yeah. Right. We were busy noticing what happened in 67 and 68. And there, the interviewing technique is interesting. That it's there that my wife and I developed the technique that I've been using since then, of getting in-depth life histories of people. And that's a very humanizing experience. You know, we all like to lie to each other. We do. We present, you know, we prepare a face to meet the faces that we meet. And they're either cordial lies or really very significant and terrible lies to hide who we might be. But I learned a frightening and very moving truth. If you ask a single question and sit back and wait for the answer, all lies finally disappear. You know what? Would you like to know what that question is? Of course you do. The question is, where were you born? When you sit and wait for the answer to that, and you let the speaker talk, and you let the tape go round and round, and don't care about how much it costs, the evasions finally go away. In us, there is someone who wants to come out, who wants to tell the truth. I've offered this advice to the CIA, but they don't seem interested. They don't have to torture anybody. I get all the truth sooner or later. Where were you born? And then the creature within beats at the bars and tears them apart and comes out, forgets all about me, forgets all about the tape recorder, because one's own life is the most precious thing one has. And one is determined not to lie about it, though one is absolutely determined to lie only about it. And the process of patient listening reveals it all. What happens when you let those sentences come out? We learned it first in the Haight-Ashbury, where we didn't have such profound problems to deal with. But in Israel, I interviewed murderers, people who throw bombs at other people, people who cut each other's throat, and others, Golda Meir among others. And I learned there that you could go into a prison planning to talk to a young man who had been arrested for blowing up a nice, quiet watchman. He tied explosives to the watchman and blew him up. It was a political gesture. He's a young Palestinian revolutionary. And you were prepared to hate him, because this particular young man had also been putting button bombs in the schoolyard where my children went to school. If you don't know what a button bomb is, I'll tell you. A button bomb, as the name suggests, is a bomb as big as a button, usually very pretty. Bright, shiny objects put in elementary schools so that little children will pick them up and they will explode and the children will lose their hands or their eyes. Yeah, you look horrified, properly. They're meant to say to what they call the oppressors, stop oppressing us. That's what the young revolutionary explained to me. I was prepared to cut his throat because I had children in that school. You let him tell you the story of his life, and all you can do is weep for the world. Because inside his head, there's nobody who wants to torture children. He doesn't care about, he doesn't want to blow out children's eyes. He'll do it because it's for a higher good. He wants the freedom of the West Bank, about which you are now reading. He wants the freedom of the West Bank. The Israelis, if you look into their eyes and listen to their story, they want to raise families and to be like everybody else. And they have a long history of being tortured and hounded. So you turn from one grief to another grief. And you aren't allowed. You may not go on believing that you know what a revolutionary is, what a torturer is, what a good guy is. You get a whole perspective that what's inside these heads is an infinite quality of confusion and commitment and love and despair and violence and sometimes evil. Sometimes. I don't know why you made me do all this, but it sounded, I seem to be off on a whole other thing. Is that what you wanted?
Yes.
Okay. It's very disconcerting to do that sort of work. Wherever there was an explosion in Israel, I trotted off with my little tape recorder and my cameras. And you learn something else about yourself. I'm a voyeur. The most grim image I have of myself is running alongside a stretcher in which a young woman who has just had a bomb explode in her face, asking her to tell me if she hates Arabs. Can you imagine running alongside, the blood streaming down her face, and I hold out the microphone. Do you hate Arabs? She says, no, I hate pain. So what have I just told you? That you excuse one gesture because I can tell you this story, and the story is illuminating. I don't know if I like the image of myself trotting alongside that stretcher, but somebody has to trot alongside the stretcher and find out how she feels. It's a hard world, isn't it? Yeah. There ought to be, as my new editors say, some upbeat note to end on. And I have one for you. You have easily the most beautiful campus I have seen in recent years. And if you don't, all of you, turn out to be Einsteins in absolute gratitude for the gift of God and the community that has given you this place, then I'll come back to haunt you. Okay. Thank you.